So as you saw in the last lesson, styling forms can be a bit time consuming. This is where a lot of people use CSS frameworks. A framework is essentially a library of CSS code that we can reuse to build beautiful, modern looking websites. There's so many frameworks out there like Bootstrap, which is perhaps the most popular framework. We also have Foundation, Semantic UI, UIKit, Materialize, and Milligram, which I just discovered yesterday. There's so many frameworks out there. This is not the complete list, and new frameworks come out all the time. Don't assume that you have to know all of these. In fact, nobody knows all these frameworks. I think most people are familiar with Bootstrap. That's used in a lot of projects, but some people don't like Bootstrap. So you might get a new project and find out that they're using Foundation or Semantic UI. There are also people out there who don't like any CSS frameworks because all these frameworks come with a lot of code that has to be downloaded on the user's computer. So these people prefer to write only the CSS code that they really need instead of getting all this extra code that provides no value. So there is really no right or wrong here. But in this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to Bootstrap and Milligram so you can see their differences. Going forward in this section, we're going to use Milligram to style our forms because Milligram is a tiny framework that is designed for speed and productivity. All right, so head over to getbootstrap.com. Here on the homepage, we have the download button. Over here, we can download Bootstrap's compiled CSS and JavaScript files. We can also download the source files. But in this lesson, we're going to use a CDN, which is short for Content Delivery Network. These content delivery networks are essentially a bunch of servers distributed around the world, and these are optimized for delivering web assets like images, CSS files, JavaScript files, and so on. So we're going to copy the first link here. This is Bootstrap on a content delivery network called jsdeliver.net. So we're going to copy this. Now, back to our markup. Here in the head section, we're going to paste that line of code. Okay? So we get a link with this href. Good. Now, back to our style sheet. We're going to delete all the styles that we wrote in the last lesson. Now, back to the browser, our form has no styles. Now, to give this form a modern look and feel, we have to apply a bunch of classes on these labels and input fields. So here on Bootstrap, on the top, let's go to Documents. Now, on the left, we have a section called Forms. So look at Form Control for examples. So if you want your input fields to look like this, then you would have to follow a markup like what you see here. For example, look at this input field. Let me zoom in. All right, this input field has a class called form-control. The label has a class called form-label. So these are Bootstrap classes that you have to learn, and quite frankly, this has a learning curve. So that's one of the downsides with Bootstrap. It has so many utility classes you have to remember. So back to our form, let's apply these classes to our labels and input fields. For the label, I'm going to set the class to form-label. For the input, I'm going to set the class to form-control. Now, for the second field, so here I'm going to set the class to form-label, and one more time, form-control. Now for buttons, we have other classes. So every button should have a class called btn. This applies the basic styles for the button. Now, depending on the color we want, we have to apply a second class. So we have a class called btn-primary. That is for our primary buttons. We have other classes like btn secondary, btn warning, btn success, and so on. Now here on Bootstrap website, if you go to the components section and then buttons, you can see a preview of these buttons. So primary, secondary, success, and so on. And these colors that you see here, they come by default, but we can always customize them. We can always change them to match the theme of our website. But that is really outside the scope of this course. So back to our markup, we apply two classes to our first button. Now for the second button, I'm going to apply two classes, btn and btn-secondary, which makes the button gray. So here's what we get. So that's pretty similar to what we built in the previous lesson. Now, as you can see, these input fields have grown to take up the entire width of the page, but we can always apply constraint to our form element. So back to our markup, here's our form element. I'm going to set the class to W50. That means 50% of the width of the parent. So here's what we get. Now, if you pay close attention, the vertical space we had after our form group is gone, So now the email label is way too close to this field. That's a violation of the law of proximity. So back to our markup, we have to replace the form group class with another utility class in Bootstrap. So I've selected form group. Now to enable multi-cursor editing, we press Command and D on Mac or Control and D on Windows. So we have two cursors. Let's change both these classes to MB-3. That is short for margin bottom 3. So here's what we get. Much better. Now, there's a lot more to Bootstrap than just building forms. So back to their documentation, under components, look, they have alerts, which look like these boxes. They also have badges, which are pretty popular. I've seen this on a lot of websites where we want to tell the user that they have, let's say, 2 new messages. So they have a lot of components. Another popular component is card for building layout like this. Again, you have seen this component on a lot of websites. So all these components make Bootstrap a very comprehensive library. However, that comes with a cost. So back to our web page, let's bring up the network panel and refresh the page. Now I'm going to set the filter to CSS. So here's the Bootstrap CSS file. As you can see, it's 20 kilobytes. Now 20 kilobytes is fairly small. It's not a big deal. But in a real website, we have several assets. We have tons of images. We have perhaps other CSS libraries. We have JavaScript libraries. So when we add all of this together, the total size might be a few hundred kilobytes, sometimes larger. Now, if the user is on a slow connection, they're going to have a poor experience. Now, for a lot of websites, this is not a big deal. The user can wait a second or two. But websites like Amazon have studied the impact of performance on sales. So sometimes 1 second delay can drop the sales by, let's say, 20%. I don't have the exact number to tell you here. So for a lot of websites, this is not a big deal. You can go ahead and use Bootstrap. But if you don't need most of the components in Bootstrap, then you might want to use one of the minimalistic frameworks like Milligram. So head over to milligram.io. As you can see on their homepage, Milligram is a minimalist CSS framework. So let's go to get started. Now we can download Milligram and add it to our project, but we can also load it from a content delivery network. So over here, you can see 3 link elements. The first one is for Google Fonts. Then we have a CSS reset, and finally, Milligram CSS. So I'm going to copy this link and add it to our head section. So right after our style sheet, I'm going to paste this line. And that means we no longer need Bootstrap. So let's get rid of it. We should also remove all these Bootstrap classes. We don't need them anymore. So here's the first one. Then we have 2 margin bottom classes. I'm going to delete them both in one go. Good. We have 2 classes for form label. Delete. And 2 classes for form control. Good. So we don't have any classes in our markup. All we have done is importing Milligram CSS. And with that, we get this beautiful form right out of the box. So this is one of the benefits of using Milligram. You don't have to learn all these classes. You don't have to read a lot of documentation. It's much easier to get started. Now let's bring up the network panel. Look at the file size. So here's Milligram. It's only 2 kilobytes. So it's 10 times smaller than Bootstrap. That's why going forward, we're going to use Milligram. So the other input fields that we're going to talk about look great by default.